once you have, a 200, 300 page project in front of you, you really have time to develop your language, unlike somewhat you can do in an article, but certainly more than you can do on a YouTube video. I can attest to that firsthand. But yeah, that was just my reflections on your introduction. But I should probably, just to introduce myself to the larger Parallax family, I'm a new name to your publishing house and your audience. So just maybe by way of introduction, I'll say what led me to this book. Yeah, through personal stories. I think philosophy has to be very personal, of course. Without that, if it's just academic and if it's just full of big words, it doesn't have any grounding. And that's definitely not the case with this book. Even if you were to pick it up, you might say, wow, this looks like a very heavy book. It's only because I'm remaining true to the discipline, but ultimately it's very, very much grounded in the experiences I've had. So let me start there. Yeah, I'm in my 40s. I grew up in the 1990s. And during that period, for those of us who lived through it, you'll remember there was this raging debate between religion and science. The new atheists, as they were called, they were launching this attack on religious faith. And for myself, being younger, not having my thoughts quite articulated, not having the language that I have now, I still intuitively knew that there was something about this debate where I could never fall into one chair or the other. And now, having read some philosophy, I can add some more words to that. And then doing that, when I look at science, for example, and look at the way that it describes the world, and I take a phenomenon like love. If science were to interrogate this phenomena as this objective phenomena to be described, it would come to descriptions that are really quite alien from what we mean with that word usually, right? It would, maybe document the flow of the blood through the body, or the way we're breathing, or neurological activity that's going on in the mind. And those would be the descriptions that science comes to, right? But when I tell somebody and I express using this word love, I don't mean any of that stuff, obviously. I mean something that's very much more rich, and it's much more embedded in the entire phenomenal experience that I have. And of course, you could add to these subjective experiences things like hoping or grieving. And I know Wittgenstein did a good job of articulating these things in his Zettel, I think, published posthumously, which is where I get a lot of this language from. But again, the science story wasn't resonating with me. But on the other hand, the defenders of the faith, so to speak, they weren't doing a good job engaging in that conversation either, from my perspective. Where religion really shines is, from my point of view, when you're talking about volition, when you're talking about the will, or you're talking about things that make moral or immoral behaviors possible. This is the realm where religion should really come and add to our discussion. But instead, they just kind of submitted to the sciences. They were, and that kind of speaks to the power of that empirical narrative, right? Because they felt that they really needed to defend themselves, questioning, carbonating of historical artifacts, finding evidence for Noah's flood, things like this. They just kind of fell into that narrative. And I could feel that neither didn't sit quite right for me. So I was very happy. I think I was probably like 2009, I discovered philosophy, and it really did feel like a third way. It felt like another way of description that I really liked. And it was really opening up a playground, you could say, for answering questions that I was really dealing with these public narratives in the 1990s that didn't seem to really resonate with me. I could also cite, if I give some other examples, like in the United States at least, maybe not in Europe so much, but the abortion debate was very popular during that time. Not so much anymore. But the pro-life people would always cite the baby's heartbeat, as some kind of threshold where now you're committing murder afterward. And I always felt like the people who were protesting these types of arguments. We're using this kind of empirical data-based evidence or way of arguing almost as like kind of a shield. Like I always felt like, okay, yeah, there's these facts, but why do you care about it, right? That's what's really more at stake for me in this. And all of this was just not coming to light in public discourse, and that always bothered me. So, yeah, I found myself in the middle of philosophy for the next 15 years up until now. So another experience that I should probably relate, and then we can, this will provide a good launchpad into discussing the ideas from the book, is my experiences abroad. I am American. I grew up in the Midwest in Indiana. I live in Chicago now, but I also spent a lot of time abroad. I spent 10 years in Denmark, which you could say, like, if reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and Heidegger's Being and Time, for example, if these were like world-shattering experiences for me, then living in Denmark was equally as profound and world-shattering. But in addition to Denmark, I've also lived, yeah, my wife is Russian, so I spent 6 months in Russia. We spent just a couple months ago, earlier this year, we spent a month in South Korea, and I've probably spent about a month total time in China. And of course, when living in Europe, I toured all the countries in Europe. So these were very profound experiences I had abroad. And it really becomes pronounced, and here's where I'm going to start to segue. When I look at my time in Denmark, obviously I spent 10 years there. So I had time to lose my Americanness, so to speak, and become a bit Danish in the process. And I could really then observe these problems I was having with public discourse, like outside the fishbowl. That's a classic example in philosophy, right? The fish in the fishbowl can't see outside the fishbowl. His entire world is contained to that. But then I could look from the outside. Because, yeah, living in Denmark, I felt that there was a bit of a oppression that was lifted from my shoulders. One pronounced thing I probably should cite is, growing up in Indiana, it's a very red state, it's very right-leaning. And sorry if you can hear these sirens in the back. I live on a very busy street where there's some emergencies often, so in Chicago, so it's not too bad. But yeah, anyway, coming back to my personal story. From Indiana, it's known as very red state, right-leaning state. So I grew up with that moral intuition of the right. I understood like how to operate in that world, and it made sense to me. That's what I grew up with. So I draw that language of moral intuition from Jonathan Haidt's book. For those who aren't familiar, like right-leaning morality might be based more in like sanctity and purity and things like that. And if you contrast that with the left, it's much more, let's say, about fairness, and he's kind of totaled these two categories filled them in with descriptors that kind of describe that. So yeah, I grew up in Indiana, but even though it's a very red state, there was still this idea that you couldn't really talk about, like during that time, for example, voting for Bush would have been taboo. You shouldn't talk about that. Like he's just a bad guy, right? He's going in and trying to promote democracy in these places that don't want it, and he's being very imperialistic with it. And yeah, it was just not good. So living abroad, of course, in Danish, they don't have to deal with that as much. So I felt liberated in that regard, but also even much more like, I don't know, sticky things to talk about. Like I felt that there was a lot less, for example, gender antagonism in Denmark. I think in the States, this is something that for me is now very pronounced. I can see it having lived outside of here. Even like if I just take an example, living in this building, like going up the elevator, there was a younger woman together with me and a resident here, a neighbor of mine, and he's maybe of a lower class. You know, you could kind of feel that, yeah, you understand. He was a lower economic class, whatever. They were trying to have a conversation. I could see in her, just her body behavior, that she was very reluctant to engage with him, not because she felt it would be like unsafe to her physical, you know, she wasn't in harm, it wasn't anything like that. It was purely just social, right? She felt like, what does it mean to me if I engage with somebody like that? It says something about who I am. So there's this, I'm trying to paint this picture of this very thick social, taboo, sacred, this very thick thing that you have to weed through. And yeah, that's going to affect our public discourse. It's going to affect how truthful I can be. I'm going to have to be very, very reserved in an environment like that. And yeah, so all of that's to give examples about living abroad, and how I was able to a bit be enlightened from that, and I still carry it with me today. So let's get to the book now, or at least book writing. Let's do that. So what did I do with these experiences, right? I had been studying philosophy for 10 years, and Donald Trump was elected to president of the United States, and there was this growing movement around the metamodern narrative, and I thought now is the right time to put together the thoughts and build out a 300-page narrative that's addressing these concerns that I've experienced. So I set out to write a book called Truth and Authenticity. It was the one prior to the Metaphysics of the Aletheyein. And today, and the sirens are back. Let's just hope they're okay, whatever's happening, right? But now when I look back on that first book, of course, all I can see are its deficiencies. I wanted to come forward with actual prescriptions, and I was trying to, I think, do too much with that book. I was trying to go the full spectrum, from trying to introduce some metaphysical words, metaphysical architectonic, try to diagnose our problems, what I've just spoken about, but then also come with prescriptions. I think that's just unfair to each of those endeavors to do that in one book. So this brings us right up to the book that we're talking about today. Because of course, if we're talking about nurturing a healthier public discourse, nurturing a healthier social fabric, which allows us to be more engaged as, let's say, democratic citizens, having a public discourse, being truthful and as authentic as we can be, and meeting our neighbors one-to-one, what becomes probably the first issue there before you can talk about diagnosing that problem and the solutions is, well, what is this thing that we're trying to nurture? Who is this we, right? And I think maybe in Denmark, this question maybe isn't as profound as it is in the States. I think being a country of immigrants, as it's often called, we tie ourselves more to demographic categories. It'd be tough to find out who this object is, the we of the people that's spoken about in the Constitution. I think the Danes have a bit more of a national heritage, which skips past a lot of that problem. But nonetheless, when I decided that I needed to take this subject and make it the subject matter of a study, there was something else important very happening at the time, which then extends this outside the United States. And that was the advent of this technology, ChatGPT, and this AI technology was becoming big. And I thought, this needs to be included in this narrative. When we want to make a study of the we can't just do it through the sociological toolkit. I think that's the go-to. I think that's what we do today. I think we're just, everything is so sociological today. Like if back in the 90s, everything was religion and science, it seems like today, even sociology is like our go-to to solve everything. And if we speak about science and religion, they're always kind of attached to sociology as one thing we could talk about, right? But if we start to include technology, and if then I even expand that, I don't want to, in the book, in this Metaphysics of the Aletheyein, I don't want to give any special attention to AI technology, but I do think it's like a trigger. I think it's like a catalyst for opening this up to bringing in things like technology and things like non-human animals, and even the entire phenomenal experience, bringing that into potentially the constitution of the we, and not thinking of the we as like a totality of eyes who can express themselves as we, right? It becomes something, the study becomes something bigger than that. And that's where I think when I look into my studies, I've obviously read books outside of philosophy, but I think that that's where metaphysics in particular shines. I think that that's the discipline that would be looking at this type and this broad of a question. So that's probably the totality of where this book takes off. Does it make sense, Tom?
Sorry, absolutely.
Okay,
Yes.
good. I didn't realize you were muted, but yeah, just to make sure everyone's following along. So when I'll go just deeper into the book then, if that's all making, if everything's following. When I go into philosophy then to kind of pick out the elements that are helpful to building this narrative, right? I don't need everybody. I don't need everybody in the Western tradition. I don't need everybody in the tradition of philosophy as a whole. I can pick out a few key elements and not even their whole philosophy, just strands, you could say, and pull those strands through the history of ideas, through the history of metaphysics as I build my narrative. And that's, you could say like the artistic quality of the book, it kind of snowballs. As I pick up pieces, it gets bigger and it gets bigger until I've got my own structure that I'm then standing on in the conclusion. I don't know, I was excited editing the work, going back and kind of feeling the work for as a onlooker. I think when I edited the book, I had told that to you, Tom, that wow, this is really fun to read this. I felt that I had done a good job of making that snowball effect. So anyway, back to the, who do I pick out? Where does the story begin of the story of metaphysics? If you go far back enough, I think you go back to Parmenides. It's not uncommon for people to go back to the history of Western thought and go back to Parmenides. I'm not the first to do that for sure. I learned from other people that was a starting point. But I think maybe just say a quick few words about that. He wrote this poem, didactic poem, as it's often called, on nature. And he starts off by framing things in terms of what is and what is not. And it's kind of an ethical poem. He's trying to direct his audience toward maintaining the ethical position to what is and never minding to what is not. And he unfolds his kind of ethical architectonic, if I say it that way, from that question. And the rest of the poem is very interesting, and I think it's even interesting to my study, but to this presentation, I won't go in deeper in it. Because I think where I would go next is although then jump 2,000 years up to the modern era with Immanuel Kant. And how I see Kant, when I read Kant, what I see that he's doing is taking Parmenides, what is, and he's trying to give the foundation for how that what is, the nature that's in the title of that poem. I don't know what it's called in German, but in English, we call it on nature, giving the foundation for how that world unfolds. And maybe others were interested in this. I've read some pre-Kantians, of course, but Kant in his series of critiques is known in the tradition for doing a very good job of articulating how that world comes into being. And of course, for people familiar with Kant, I'm just going to give this as a very 101. If people are familiar, they're just going to have to dredge through this, but maybe there's value in the way I tell the story. But I want to keep it, of course, general audience as well. Kant basically took this as, this is the way I would describe this, like metaphysics on one hand and physics on the other. And if physics and Newton and what he was doing, describing the laws of physics, was very important 100 years before Kant was living and changed the way people saw the world, this was dealing all with causal explanation. This happens, then this happens. It's very mechanical. And Kant wanted to say, yeah, but there's a whole side to the world that isn't described here. And I've kind of alluded to this with the love example I gave earlier, right? There's all of what happens from here on outward. So the language that I take forward out of that is, Kant says that there's conditions and then there's possibilities, conditions of possibility. And he develops a whole architectonic there. And of course, he's a man of the Enlightenment, so he's very interested in using the language which was popular in the time, and that's for him reason. And I think in our modern language, at least for me, I would think he's just kind of building out the architectonic of the mind, right? Whether we call it reason, mind, consciousness. This kind of orients us to what Kant was interested in. And yeah, so I think if you're looking at the world kind of as an isolated, atomic, free individual, as Enlightenment people were thinking, this was very important to them to kind of liberate the individual. This was important to their project in that time period. I think Kant's explanation is good, right? It invests the individual, which is now the subject, right, with all of these faculties to interpret nature. But if I kind of alluded to this as you trace the history of ideas through Western thought and these Western giants that I'm talking about, urbanization was becoming popular, coming out of the Enlightenment. And of course, in the history of ideas, we call this period the Romantics, right? They were starting to become very skeptical of this description of the human subject. And the Romantics were very concerned with the will and things like that. These ideas of passions were kind of neglected in this very mechanical picture of the world. So rightfully so. One of the guys that I particularly like, I think a lot of people are very fascinated with this very dense and monumental book, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. For me, that's the book I take with me after I leave Kant and take this conditions of possibility with me. And for me, Hegel is very, very profound because, and maybe I should just say as a side note, like I was attending a philosophy event here in Chicago on metaphysics, and at that event, the host started out not where I thought he was going to start out with these guys I'm talking about. He started out with the Mayan creation myth. I thought that was a very interesting place to start when talking about metaphysics. But in talking about this kind of unfolding of the creation of the world, and you could mirror this in the biblical narrative or whichever, they always start off with the creation of the world in a very causal fashion, right? Some entity created the world and set it in motion. But it was at that moment I realized you can read the phenomenology of spirit in a similar type of way. It can be looked at as a modern creation myth. And that was very profound for me. And the way that Hegel does it, I can feel I'm getting excited explaining this, is because he starts with Kant's individual I, like I'm an I, and he kind of just buys into that and doesn't question that. That's his position that he's starting from. But through a dialectic process of an I engaging with another I. And if we think about this kind of in terms of anthropology and very early humans, the I confronts another I, and those possibilities that we share, the possibilities that we don't share are just mine and they're yours, but the possibilities that we do share, making distinctions like where Hegel starts with night and day, or maybe we notice reoccurring meteorological phenomena, right? And there's 4 of them a year and they seem to repeat. And now we have the seasons, and that's helpful to us to identify that. He kind of takes us through this whole process by weaving the I and the you, and then he also refers to the we, him and his readers, this kind of omniscient historical observer, right? By braiding all of this, he kind of shows how there's this unfolding of this world by making further articulations that are useful to us, right? And he goes from very early just sense perception, things that we don't think of as true because our senses could deceive us, of course. What we see is often wrong, right? But through, again, the braiding, we come to what is called in philosophical language, we have the objective truth, right? Because we share that truth. So it's no longer subjective, it's objective. So it's a very fun way to read Hegel. I don't know how popular that is, but I kind of happened upon that thought myself. So I take all of that with me into this book for sure. But of course, the problem with Hegel that I think, and it may be weird for people to make this next move in the history of ideas when talking about metaphysics, because he's not a name that's usually referred to, but Karl Marx, he's usually more of a political philosopher, right? But I think it would be negligent, and I think he's helpful in telling the story, at least the story that I go in my book, by going to Marx after Hegel. And of course, for Hegel, all of this stuff is still happening in the I. It's one I and another. The only reason we can talk about it is because Hegel is coming from this perspective of the omniscient we, so we can have some objectivity about it. But ultimately, it's the phenomenology of spirit or of mind, and it's very subjective what's happening there. So in philosophy, it's what we call idealism, right? It's a very idealist philosophy. It depends on humans. And Marx was like, well, yeah, but that's not entirely true because we have our material condition that affects us. So he kind of, I don't know where the quote comes from, but at least it's popular to talk about online that Marx flipped Hegel on his head and said, okay, you're standing upside down, and instead of talking about ideas, that we need to talk about the material condition that has conditioned us. And from a metaphysical perspective, this doesn't seem very interesting to say, yeah, we're born into our material condition, and of course that conditions us. So for me, to understand like the profundity of that move that we make when we bring Marx into the story, is we need some language from Immanuel Kant. And that is to talk about the transcendental versus the empirical, and the real versus the ideal. And these are highly technical terms in the discipline, but I think that I need to say something just about them in order to make my case about why I bring Marx into this story. Because otherwise, I said, it doesn't seem like it's a significant move in the metaphysical architecture to bring Marx in. So transcendental, if we refer back to Kant, speaks to that conditions of possibility. When we're speaking about a transcendental thing, we're describing something within that conditions of possibility architecture. Contrast that with empirical, that's obvious. That's what the science studies. That's what then follows after it. That's that causal and Newton and all of this, which goes after. And then the other two words that I make use of are real and ideal. These words may be a bit more intuitively understood. Real is things that in the philosophical language are things that are independent of human beings. The real material is real. It exists with or without us, right? Whereas ideal, I've kind of hinted at that already when I called Hegel and Kant's philosophy idealist. That is things that depend on human being. So the easy example there are things like, our ideal virtues, like liberty, feminism, things like this. These are things that are dependent on us. So coming back then, taking those four words and now understanding the significant move that Marx made, from my perspective, is that he, when he said that we're not dealing with a idealist dialectic like we are in Hegel, we're dealing with a material dialectic. What he did was this. He said that there's things that are transcendentally real, things that are belonging to the conditions of possibility but are independent of us, material. But then through our praxis, to use the Greek word, through our production with this real material, we come to something that is empirically ideal. So it follows from causality. It's something that we describe through science, but it is completely dependent on us because we're the ones who have produced it, right? So Marx, of course, he wasn't so much a metaphysician, so I'm adding a lot to the interpretation here. And if we say that this is material dialectic, it sounds even less like profound. But in Marx, and in order for this material dialectic description to work, the one I've just given, we have to understand things even like the previously examples I gave, like feminism and liberty. These things are the material we work with, even if we don't traditionally think of them as material. Through this process of the material dialectic, being born into the conditions that we're born into, by working with this conditions of possibility material, we come to the world that we have, this very rich social, material world that we have. So it's much more encompassing. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's much more encompassing than just like material, right? It's the entire social world that we live in. that we construct. So for me, that's the move that Marx does. And I think it's important to note this kind of history of ideas that I'm charting us through. Obviously, like during Marx's time, if urbanization was happening between Kant and Hegel, then obviously industrialization was happening for the time of Marx, and he had to reckon with this. But more so than that, there was another point I wanted to say in regards to Marx. And there's another siren disturbing us. Yeah, if you look at this progression from Kant to Hegel, they're still very much concerned with consciousness, perception, and the I, the individual subject, even if Hegel deviates a bit and becomes just a bit more sociological with his dialectic, by this braiding. He's very at the cusp of the development of the social sciences and sociology. And if you look at it that way, then clearly Marx is very sociological. He goes in full steam with this. And I think that's important to note. And I think that was a good time to introduce that when I'm talking about the production of our material and social world that Marx added. So the last philosopher, before I continue that strand up to the present moment, the last metaphysician who is very important to my narrative was Martin Heidegger. And in the book, people might refute me, but I do make the audacious claim that he's the last true, real metaphysician in the West, kind of before Western history gets very concerned with technology and authority, and it kind of makes this turn. I think like Habermas, for example, explicitly goes post-metaphysical after Heidegger, and the world wars have happened, they've now ended, and we've become very much concerned with, operations and orientations of power, things like this. So yes, metaphysical discourse didn't talk, people still kept wrestling with those ideas, but there hasn't been a really profound book like Heidegger's Being and Time, in my opinion, written since Heidegger. So I claim that he's the last. And if we're to pick up metaphysics today, that's the starting point to do so. So that is also where my book starts with Heidegger, you could say, calls back to the ancients, and kind of pulls us up to the very moment that we're in, and has that snowball that I was talking about. It's the literary device I was going for anyway. So anyway, just to say quickly about what Heidegger adds. He adds a lot, but for this presentation, I'll just keep it very simple. The first division of this monumental work, Being and Time, that I had mentioned, is a working out, in my opinion, of that material dialectic. Not my opinion, in my reading of Being and Time. Because Marx introduced the idea, saying that Hegel had it upside down, but he's a political theorist. He wants to change the world. He doesn't want to think about it. So he doesn't really develop the metaphysical architecture. He doesn't do metaphysics, right? Even if he had a contribution. So in my opinion, again, Heidegger really lays out how that transcendentally real material becomes our empirically ideal material, something objective, and also circulates back. So we have this. And of course, the famous example for people who are very familiar with Heidegger, you're going to understand this. I'm not going to make a new example. I'm just going to do the one people usually do. And that is the carpenter hammering. He sees this as like the phenomenological moment of praxis. I used that word earlier, where the world comes into being, as I've talked about. So how does Heidegger how does he illustrate this? So imagine I'm hammering, I'm trying to fasten two pieces of wood together, and then all of a sudden this tool that I have, it breaks, or it stops doing its job, and then I look at what I have, and I realize I actually was doing my job with, say, a rotten piece of wood. It was very insufficient for doing the job, right? It was falling to pieces because, say, I'm a very early, think anthropologically, I'm This is the story of how the world becomes richer through a series of articulations. Think Hegel here, right? So, I'm doing my job, I'm doing my praxis in a shared world with people, and there's a breakdown moment. And through that breakdown, I now have to say, well, that piece of wood, this rotten piece of wood, didn't do the job very well. Luckily, there's a stone nearby. I pick up the stone and I can finish my job with that. And through that, I can make a articulation, much like Hegel's dichotomies. Maybe I can frame things in terms of softness and hardness, the wood versus the stone or whatever. So you could say that, like, through a series of breakdown moments in human history, reading Being and Time very anthropologically, we can see how the world has become more articulate, more nuanced, and richer, and so forth, as the human animal has evolved through its different stages. So, yeah, those are kind of the elements I take with me as I bring us up through history to the moment where I think metaphysics now, it needs an update, you could say. And I think that that's where my book is filling the hole. And I know it's a very audacious claim to say, to put myself on par with these monumental thinkers from world history. But again, I don't think, from what I see, and I don't read everything, of course, but from what I see in the thinkers and writers who make it onto the world stage or whatever, they're not doing what those guys were doing. They're not dealing with metaphysics richly like those guys were doing. So yeah, so the question, I guess, is, I had something more to say about that, but I can't remember right now. But I guess the point is, what I need to say is, well, what is it that all of those guys are doing that I see does not touch upon my original questions that I posed at the very beginning of this presentation, right? And that is that they're all very biased in human being and the human animal's way of operating with the world. And I think that this is something that goes back to Aristotle, and I talk about that history in my book. And maybe you can trace it all the way back to Parmenides. I've already mentioned that name, other Greek thinkers. Maybe it goes back further to ancient Egypt. I don't know. But I think tracing that history, what we've inherited, what we know as Western history, for me, Aristotle is very pronouncedly biased towards the human animal and its way of being. And I think again, going back to the beginning, if we're going to now imagine that technology presents a different way of being, if we're going to include human animals or non-human animals in this structure, if we're going to include and open this up for the entire phenomenal experience, then that's a bias you have to get away from. And that is the move that I make in the book. And so that's where the title comes from. I should probably say something about the title, right? Because it's a bit mysterious, and that's a call you have to make as an author. Do you want it very obvious, the title? Do you want it how do you want to draw the reader in? And I chose a bit of intellectual mystery, like, oh, I've not seen that word before, but it sounds enticing. What could it mean, right? So for Aristotle, Aletheyein, it describes this aletheia. If we break that first part off, is what we would translate today as truth. And in the modern interpretation of Aristotle, this Aletheyein would be the human animal's way of being, such that it encounters truth. Such, in like Heideggerian language, it's such that it is disclosing and uncovering the world, right? And I think that idea is very animated in modern philosophy. We really see the human animal at the center of the world. Modern values are based on this idea that when humans get together and join together and unite forces, anything should be possible. We should be able to conquer nature. We should be able to domesticate even space, right? This is the foundation of a lot of the stories that we tell ourselves. Science fiction, so forth. I always say that if Star Trek, and its conquering of space is a very modern, value-laden narrative, and X-Files is maybe this postmodern narrative. It's skeptical of everything, right? So yeah, this story about man being at the center of the world is very animated in modern narrative. Um, yeah, and I think that's I don't want to get too much into the book. I think what I want to do is just kind of give the playground that I'm working in. But if you strip that Aletheyein from human being, and it becomes kind of an object of study in itself, this kind of progression that you see, and this kind of uncovering of the truth that you see, kind of this world historical, anthropological, if we strip the anthropological from it, this narrative we see, such that we're now encountered with the technology that we have. That's kind of the foundation that I want to give. I want to describe the foundation for that thinking space, I guess you could say. And interesting, maybe I'll say this, and then I'll kind of ask you, Tom, if what I'm saying makes sense or if you have questions. But I will say this, like when you, and I didn't anticipate this, when you make that move, when you strip this Aletheyein from human being, and you kind of set it there as an object on its own to be studied and to watch it. Honestly, that's what I do. It's what I did when I wrote this book. You end up entering, and I didn't anticipate this. It ends up looking very like pagan. You enter this kind of pagan space of thinking. And I found that to be very profound. And that happened to me several times when often I don't tell people I wrote a book, I made a study, right? When I studied this, it was interesting what I was hit with. And it was very, very profound and interesting, even interesting experience for myself. And, you know, the book is what people call dense. They call this Western philosophy of Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, very dense and difficult to read and not very intuitive and so forth. My book is in that tradition. You know, it's not really making a lot of apologies for the reader. It wants to remain very true to the discipline. But if you make the commitment and you join me on this journey to walk through this book and make the steps, I hope that you have these experiences that I had while studying it, because I don't feel that in a very pagan manner, to be honest. They don't come from me. It came from studying the phenomena around me. It told me what I needed to write in a very who's that English poet? William Blake, is it? I think he described all of his poems coming to him from because he grew up in a very Christian oriented worldview. He described them coming from the demons, right? I wouldn't use that language because it's coded with all kind of value, but really, do the study like a scientist does. Pay attention to the phenomena and have these revelations. It's yeah, maybe I'm saying too much a bit about my personal experience now, but anyway, it was fun writing, and I think if the reader can go through this, it's worth the effort. So does this make sense, Tom? I mean, I don't.
No, it's awesome. No, it's awesome.
Okay, good.
I think before we open that up for our guests to ask questions or impressions or all of this, I mean, there's so much to untangle and add on or to question regarding what you just presented. And what kind of stuck with me is always the history that you shared. Coming from the United States and living some time abroad and having different understandings of what we means. And this is Denmark or even Germany or even Spain having different history, a different shared background than the United States, and to be able to have these different mindsets. I always have, in discussion with people from America, always, also in like political questions. So where are we? Where's the American left and where's the European left, which are kind of completely different. Another thing that's interesting, and maybe you can find a way to all weave this kind of together, is like when you talk about the history and when you talk about talking about truth and to rethink truth and to reconstitute truth in this time that we are in, where do you situate your own endeavor to reconstitute or rethink this, because it's not modern, obviously it's not deconstructive postmodernism. So where historically speaking, so where do you see yourself and in the book in this context. So maybe you can find a way to talk a little bit about these kind of different things.
Yeah, it's interesting that you direct us there because truth was really the subject matter of that first study that I wrote that I think is very deficient now. And it's not so much the subject matter of this book, but nonetheless,
Right.
I mean, it's essential to the book. I mean, the Aletheyein, the short of that, Aletheia, in Greek is what we translate. The Latin translators translated that into Latin as verum or truth or whatever, but it doesn't mean exactly quite the same thing. But yeah, it's you're not wrong to go there, I should say. And for me, I maybe in my personal story, I didn't say this, but around that 2017, when I thought writing books became important to me, uh, was also that media frenzy, that post-truth media frenzy, right? So I really felt like we needed a public confrontation with truth and not like what is true or what is false, because that would bypass the whole profundity of the question, right? We needed to talk about the nature of truth. And to do that, I called back on, even in that first book, I called back to the Greeks already. And in those studies, I encountered the Aletheyein for the first time. And what was profound for that, for me in doing that study, and this, I mentioned Parmenides, this I think goes back to Parmenides and his on truth or on nature. For the Greeks, Aletheia would include today what we call the true and the false. It's everything, you know. In that poem, Parmenides talks about him being carried by the messengers on chariot to the domain of truth, and the gates open, and nature is spread open, right? Everything is included there. Things that are true, false, false gold is there, and true gold is there, right? You can't get outside of the everything that's there. So that was very, very profound for me. And when you dive into the book, for people who read it, you will see why that is so profound. I think that if you're going to have a confrontation and eventually meet, like what I call in the book, the actual and authentic we, you know, not the we that we talk about when, you know, in public discourse, sometimes we say, oh, we need to do this. And often what you mean is they need to do it, right?
Right.
Even though like in a democracy, we should see ourselves as active politicians. Like everybody should be able to affect the social and material world that we find ourselves in. We don't feel that way. You know, we should do this. Anyway, now I've kind of lost the other train. I'm sorry. But yeah, there's profundity in saying that everything should be included in the truth, the true and the false. And, you know, actually, as I write the second part of the book, which is If This Is the Metaphysics, the book that just published, and I'm now writing, if you observe this, what comes of it, what kind of ethical and moral directives come out of this, I talk about the evil nature of man. Well, you need to even to confront that, right? That can't be something that is stigmatized. If there are things that we feel that are uncomfortable, you know, that are immoral, we need to confront all of this if we're to encounter that actual and authentic we. I don't know, that's my response to your question about the nature of truth. Oh, I think like if you go through, like if you look on Wikipedia, the different types of truth that there are, because I'm not the first to think about, you know, different categories of truth. I think that, and I bring this up with some hesitation because I didn't prepare to talk about this. I didn't know you were going to ask that question. So I don't really recall all these different categories that people talk about. But you might say, on the surface level, based on what I said, that the type of truth I have that I'm operating in is this very social truth that depends on people agreeing on it, right? Like if you're a scientist in your field, you do your empirical investigations, and then other scientists do theirs, and only if they map onto each other can we say we've discovered something. If there's incongruency, then things are still yet to be decided, right? And we can't say that they're the truth, but they're outstanding hypotheses still. And I hesitate from saying that because it sounds very social, and I just made the case that I'm trying to get out of sociology. And I maintain that that's the case in the book, but for the sake of answering your question, I will answer it that way, if that's okay.
Okay, good. But you left out the second part of the question regarding where you situate yourself
Remind me.
historically, basically, because you're working on a second book with a specific theme.
Mm-hmm.
and so and so you, because again, you're not a modernist, right?
Mm.
So and so
Ah.
let me ask it let me ask it a different way. So
Mm.
if you look at the landscape as it is today, philosophically speaking, and not just within the liminal web, just where we are in the Western culture. So what is it that you want to what is that thing, the mimetic idea that you want to put out there, in one sentence, like that, where
Mm.
people can latch on to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you post something interesting by throwing that modern category out there, and I've only teased talking about that postmodern, and it is true. I wrote this book with a subtitle of the foundation of the meta-modern paradigm. So I am trying to situate myself within that type of historical narrative, right? But now you've introduced that in terms of truth, and you've also asked for me to do that in one sentence for people to
Yeah,
take
sure.
away.
But
And you
this
can.
is an emergency, so there we go.
Yeah, I need the sirens right now. Um, I'm not well prepared to answer that question, but I would say that it looks, and when I said about the pagan narrative, I think that that's probably where I would jump off from. But then you could retort and say, yeah, but we've had paganism before. So why are we just going back in a circle? And we're just kind of coming back to where we were before? That could be. But I think if you read the ancients, for me, it would be wrong to just say we haven't evolved past that period. I think that there is something that we take from us from the modern, for sure. And these four big names in philosophy I've mentioned, I don't think that they're just to be neglected. I think that they've made that description much richer. And I'm not, I do say that in the book. I do think that these guys are trying to pull what was lost in the Christendom of Europe, this kind of pagan spirit, with them, where you spend more time. Yeah, today what we would call it, probably, to be honest, Tom, we'd probably call it being spiritual. We're trying to tap into our more spiritual side and spend time with nature and recover that what was lost, that experience and those practices that were lost, in being staunch empiricists during the positive period and so forth. So, well, actually, through talking to you, I'm getting a bit more articulate about it. I talk about that stuff in my first book, like what positivism has robbed from us, for example, um, and discover a truth which is more in line with like what we read in Old English texts. Like one of the texts I analyzed for that first book, which again deals with truth as a subject matter, was Boethius, the Roman Senator Boethius, who was sentenced to prison for treason. I think as you read those texts, you are opened up to a new way of thinking about truth, not just in terms of things that are what is correct and incorrect in an objective sense. Thinking about truth as a place you sit in. And that's much closer to the truth that I'm talking about when I say that I want to nurture spaces for us to be in so that we can encounter that actual and authentic we. So it's, truth is a dwelling is, I think, a phrase I use in that first book when interpreting Boethius.
Indwelling, you say?
Yeah, as a dwelling place.
Yes. I mean, as much as politics and like maybe you dig a little bit deeper into your view on politics and how a reshifting, a rethinking of that can have effects on politics and what you envision.
Yeah, for sure. It's obviously something I'm very passionate about. I speak to local politicians here in Chicago, so I'm also very engaged politically. locally. Yeah, everything I do is to, yeah, I mean, to say that like democracy is in jeopardy seems kind of like dramatic, but, and I usually don't try to speak in such dramatic terms, but it's not wrong to say we should have our eye on democracy because there is surely being jeopardized in one way or another, clearly, right? So it is something I'm concerned about and passionate about. But you know, we didn't. The way I want to answer your question, Tom, and thanks for asking it. I don't know how much time do you think we should spend on this, just to give me a frame for
As
also the
long as you
people
need.
listening. Okay. Um, I didn't really give a lot of words to something, a strand that goes through my thinking that I think your question now opens up, and I can address. If modernism was very much interested in establishing a political economy that animated the individual and the individual's rights. If we kind of grant that description, you know, and then from there we get all of our democratic institutions, which the courts, making sure people have fair trials. You know, it's all about making sure the individual is liberated to have the economy that is, what does it say in the Constitution? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in America, right? That is the ultimate outcome that we're trying to produce with the liberal political economy and all of the institutions that we established during that period. If we then look at an evolution that happened, and I've already painted the picture of this development in Western thought, at least, we enter this sociological way of thinking, which says that's great about the individual, but he lives in an environment, you know, it lives in an environment. And I mentioned this in the context of Marx, and, you know, his name is attached to socialism, right? And that political economy is looking a bit different from liberal political economy, right? That economy is not looking solely at securing the individual with rights in order to liberate its in the free market, in the market, right? It's well, in like hardcore Marxist terms, they have just a very fundamental different view of what organized people should be doing. Like Jean Locke, if we look at him as and take him as the case example of the founder of liberalism or liberal political economy, there's no account of production. There's no account of like how we create value. We're only going to lay out the commonwealth, right? We're only going to lay out the structure, the governing structures. Production of value should happen outside of that. We leave that to the people to do. Our job in government is just to make sure it's fair. Marx thought almost, you could argue, the exact opposite. He thought the organized people, the main thing they should be doing would be, or not that they should be, but in actuality, what they do is they are creating value in the world. And the governance structure is just one part of that, right? So it needed to be more robust in Marxism. And yeah, eventually the proletariat revolution had to seize control to make sure that this was including everyone. This is why the current manifestation of this is about, you know, inclusivity and means of production and all of that, making sure things are fair and wealth is distributed evenly, and that's kind of the modern form this is all taken. But some critics today, like I don't know if he's made it to Europe, but in America there's this political commentary, political pundit, you could say, James Lindsay, and he's very hard on the Marxists. He's such a classic liberal. And he really critiques the Marxists for not being concerned with rights of individuals. And I think his critique is both right and wrong. Like he's right that they aren't concerned about that, but he's wrong to say that that's not something that should be looked at. Like just being a staunch classical liberal for me would be very archaic. It would be the wrong move to make. I think it worked when our economy was agrarian, you know. It doesn't work today. Our structures are just too large for that, right? But swinging the other way and bringing everything, governance, the means of production, everything into this kind of socialist framework hasn't really proven itself very effective, right? So this is really where I think I'm laying the foundation for talking about things in a new way. And maybe someone will come on and say, but what about this person? But I work in a local government think tank as a day job also. And our job is to think about local governments and local government finance. And again, from where I sit, I don't see anyone making the exact moves I'm doing. So if I just lay that out, is if liberal political economy was very much concerned about producing private goods, goods that individuals could consume and were good in their life. And if we look at, this is a bit of a stretch, but if we look at the developments in sociology, they were looking to produce goods for the public, what is good for the everyone to enjoy. And that would include things like socialized or nationalized healthcare, right? This is good for the public. And what is good for the public is good for the individual. But what both of these paradigms are not interested in, and what I see that we need to set up a better political economy to do, is the production of what is usually called relational goods. Because neither of these other economies are interested in that. They're far too materialistic for that. And relational goods in economic theory, the easiest example is trust. Trust is something that all of us have to have if democracy is going to function. If we distrust each other, it doesn't matter how many checks and balances we have on the system. I truly believe that we could never have such a massive structure that could work without having trust. And this is, for example, something I experienced in Denmark contra the United States. I do think Denmark did a better job of producing these relational goods, such as trust. I mean, maybe this isn't like a very big deal, but for Americans, it would be like when you walk down the walking street in Vejle or Copenhagen, you often see like jewelers with their jewelry just out there. Like you would never have that in the States, obviously. But that's just like one example. I just felt like something that's often not articulatable in the social fabric. So I do believe that you can become better at producing this type of good, but again, liberal and social political economy doesn't prioritize this right now. And Tom, to be fair, let's be fair, right? You mentioned Hansi Freinart and the two authors behind them, Daniel Gurtz and Emil Friss. They do actually touch upon, they don't call it relational goods. I don't know if they're aware of, maybe in Europe it's talked about differently. In America, this is how we talk about it. They do talk about this type of production of good, but they don't talk about it like that, like producing a good. And I think that's a missed opportunity, and you miss some leverage that you get with that. And yeah, I'm really answering a long-winded way, but obviously I have a lot to think about this. Like if I go back further, if I can keep telling this narrative in different ways, like Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism, was very interested in outcomes, and he made happiness and the experience of pleasure or pain the standard by which governments should write policy, right? But again, that's a very individual experience. You could argue, oh no, happiness is like the Heideggerian thing. When you experience the birthday party, everyone is experiencing it. You could argue that it's a social phenomenon, but at the end of the day, I think even Bentham admits it's a personal experience. So again, very much interested in the production of personal goods. And I think coming back then to Hansi, that leverage is missed when you're not pulling that thread from Bentham up to today. You miss a very helpful articulation that I think policymakers will benefit from. And this, how does that all relate to truth and authenticity in these venues? It's very much related, right? You're only going to be able to produce that type of good when you're trying to animate better platforms for democracy, in my opinion.
So maybe to wrap this up, and maybe I may be going on a tangent here, but also drawing from your experience, you might say something to this, because you mentioned America having a different way of dealing with these questions, like let's say Denmark or the Europeans. And let me find a phrasing to bring this all together. So then you're talking about democracy, and what I see are two things basically. So that the categories of what, let's say, on the most basic level, what is left and what is right is completely confusing. Nobody knows anything now what that means or what, and so this is
Interesting.
one side. So on one side, like, how can we deal with these completely, confusing categories? Because the more you think about it, the more it appears like, what Richard Rorty said about postmodernism is like nobody know the main thing about postmodernism is that nobody knows what it is, and it's still like this a little bit. And so we have to rethink all these categories. What does it mean? And you having this experience of, Europe and American, you I guess you perfectly know well that these two things don't map properly onto it. What left means in European and right means in the United States. That being one side, the other side is, so you talk about democracy and going, when we go back to Plato, it's like he said that, things are circles and we can't escape these circles. And it's inbuilt in democracy that it comes to an end through very, very specific means, basically. And so we're still fighting against these political seasons that span hundreds of years. And so the question is like, how do we approach this multitudes of categorical problems, problems that we're just subjected to because that's how it goes, so what, like, how do you think about these things from your point of view?
Yeah, there's all this baggage we have to inherit, right?
Right.
And if we're going to be value citizens, we have to engage in people who are using, in many cases, like a broken language that's then, like it, for example, I can only like concur with you on this difference between the way political language is used across the pond, and for me, things make so much more sense in the way Europeans talk about it than Americans do. Like, because liberal became associated specifically with this left-leaning value set, or what Jonathan Haidt calls the moral intuition of the left, then we needed a different word to talk about the classical libertarian, who is more rightist, according to our discourse. So now we have to talk about libertarians, when in fact they're just liberals. So
Right.
there's all this baggage that you have to work yourself out of in American political discourse. And for me, I find it unnecessary. I really have a hard time speaking to my fellow Americans. Whereas in Europe, I found it just much more concrete. I could, yeah, liberal is a liberal. It makes sense, and it's a John Lockean liberal. I get that. That makes a lot of sense to me. But so I guess your open-ended question is, how do we then work with this baggage we've inherited? Well, yeah, maybe doing podcasts like this is really the only way to approach it, right? To show the history of ideas, because there's really a disconnect between what we see happening historically and the political discourse as we see it today. I don't know. I don't approach that in my writing. That's going to be a much more like dependent on certain locations that you find yourself in, because now we're talking very much America, but even maybe within America, there's less or more baggage depending on that. I was at a
No,
very
I mean,
healthy,
it's
I was
sorry.
at a
Yeah, no,
very,
no, but go ahead.
I was at a very healthy debate during the Democratic National Convention, which happens in Chicago. I had the privilege or luxury to attend this thing, and we were dissecting progressivism, which is another word that is loaded with baggage today, because we specifically associate progressivism in the United States today, and we think of it exclusively as wrapped up with socialism, right? The mayor of New York only reiterates this. Here in Chicago, we've got a very progressive mayor, which means, when we use that word, socialist baggage. But man, this was so good to take us back to like the history of progressivism in the United States, which wasn't filled with that, and we can look at it more objectively instead of loaded with all this value baggage. I don't know. Sorry to interrupt you. It was just another example that we have to work ourselves out of this, and it speaks to being a good intellectual, just to being a good citizen, right?
Right. Yeah, hopefully, your book will, add some perspectives on this and yeah, maybe hopefully that's the
Yeah. Well,
purpose of this actually.
thanks for being a part of it, Tom. You're
Sure.
part of this also. I'm glad. I'm very flattered that I mean you read a ton of books, and so if you feel like there's value in my book, that's very flattering. Or again, my
Of course.
study. The book is just the product.
Of course. Thank you, Justin, for taking the time. Thank you for everybody who was here, for joining. That was a lot of fun. Thank you, Justin, again for doing all this. And yeah, good luck and great success. And let's see how it goes, huh?
Let's continue the discussion.
Yes. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Will you stay just in for a sec?
Mhm.